need to accept. So this group of presentations has been put together by the York PGCE cohort in January 2021. They're going to be presenting about their areas of historical expertise, areas which they have studied recently at university, and we hope that it will be useful to colleagues for catching up on matters to do with latest scholarship and how they might relate to the classroom. And our first topic this morning is going to be from Mike Ford and Jess Wragg, talking about empire and post-colonialism.
So while Mike sorts the sharing of screen, we have also sent a knowledge organizer to everyone. Should be on your Gmail. Because of the formatting, it works a lot better if you can open it in Word rather than open it as a GDoc. When it opens as a GDoc, it gets a little bit angry and doesn't seem to stay where it's put. So
yeah. And Jess, what I can do is I can later load that as a Word that sticks in Word onto the G drive and then share it with anybody listening to the podcast afterwards. So I will put a G drive link with the link later so I can sort the technology.
Thank you, Helen.
Brilliant. Can anybody see my screen at the minute? I'm not sure if we're allowed to do that. There we are. Can everybody see that now?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're talking about the approach to teaching the empire, and we have sort of gone with a British approach, but with elements of comparing other empires as well. So traditionally, the teaching of empire tends to be very Anglo or Britocentric, and it tends to skate over the indigenous culture, language and histories of the indigenous people that have existed before. So you know, in the 20th century, you get a lot of histories that start with sort of Indian history, for example, starting in 1611, when actually you know, humans have actually existed on the Indus Valley for, you know, absolute millennia. So it's a complete ignorance and whitewash of previous histories. And I think that there's also a sort of a glorification of empire, that it's something to be proud of, and I think that there's a sense of British nationality and national pride being tied up with our the sort of the historical colonial past. And I think that there tends to be a sense of benevolence that Britain comes into these colonies to sort of take over in a helpful way, because these peoples are not complex enough, they're not capable of ruling themselves, and that can be very very difficult and obviously very far from the truth. And I think that atrocities are justified as a result, and can even be diminished or ignored. So yeah, Jess.
So in discussing empire and how empire is taught in the classroom, me and Mike sort of came to a conclusion of what we feel that lessons relating to empire and the British Empire should be. And we believe that to sort of teach empire with a sensitivity and integrity, these lessons need to be post-colonial, comparative, and intersectional. We're going to be going over those terms in more detail and how we would apply them in the classroom, but that's sort of the conclusion through our understanding of empire and what we've seen of some of the mistakes, as Mike has discussed, of how they've been taught in the classroom. Just a little bit of detail about what the picture is. The picture is actually a piece of artwork from a Nigerian artist. It's depicting the scramble for Africa, as it's often referred to. And what I think is brilliant about this is, and you could use this in the classroom, is that it's a Nigerian perspective on an often depicted instance in imperial history. And what they've done here is they have, they're all wearing traditional dress of the 19th century, but it is in materials from African cultures, and it's sort of showing how what they were getting and the materials and everything like that, the cottons and everything, were coming from those places that were then making those clothes. And all that. I think it's a great way, if you use that in comparison with other images, to sort of get kids to engage with that idea of differing perspectives on empire. But yeah. Next slide, please, Mike.
So I'm going to talk about post-colonialism. As I previously stated, the traditional teaching of empire tends to be gravitating towards an Anglo-centric view, and it tends to whitewash or completely ignore cultures that previously existed and their histories. So it's an academic approach that was first coined in the 1980s, and it really has gained traction in sort of current discourse, and it's about shifting shifting the viewpoints from the colonizer to the colonized, and really sort of taking a more balanced view. And I think it redresses the imbalance by seeking and focusing on perspectives, opinions, and legacies of colonized people themselves. So it's not to say that British histories should be disregarded, or European sort of historians' perspectives should be disregarded, but it should be that there's a more focused, there's more focus on sort of colonized history. So, for example, I did my dissertation was a post-colonial approach, and I sought to disprove Niall Ferguson's theory that Britain had disseminated representative assembly to India. And the way that I did that was by recognizing that in the 50,000 years that humans have lived in India, and they've had some form of representative assembly. I think that the Westminster system of government is what Britain introduced to India. I wouldn't necessarily say that representative assembly was given to India by Britain, as Britain had only arrived in 1611. So it's sort of redressing the balance by claiming that pre-colonial history, and by keeping language, culture, and customs alive, which are often were discouraged or changed during by being colonized. So, for example, in India, again, to go back to India, there is a very deep entrenched tradition of the third gender, and they have a very fluid concept of gender in terms of religious, sort of religious zealous kind of thing. And I think with the British taking control of India, they introduced the penal laws, which then introduced the concept of homosexuality being illegal, and that is still still entrenched in Indian culture today. But it's something that prior to the British arrival in India had not existed, and that's not to say that homosexuality was completely acceptable or widely celebrated. It's just the fact that it was there and it seemed to have been tolerated, and the British came over and completely changed that, and now it's a very prejudiced society.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about comparative history. This is an approach that you often find in the disciplines of cultural and intellectual history. I will say, to start off with, there has been, and there continues to be, some negative association with comparative history, because in the past it has been used by some historians, such as Toynbee, to sort of create this narrative of the West being more developed and successful by comparing them in those sorts of ways, and so it is sometimes avoided. However, there has been an increasing argument that actually the comparative approach can be really useful for avoiding a sort of homogenized view of history, because, and particularly things like transcultural history is a really useful tool that we can use to avoid sort of making baseline assumptions about particularly something like empire, where the experience of empire can be vastly different for different peoples, whether in time or in culture. And so it can be a great tool for that. If I could have the next slide, please, Mike. So in terms of applying a comparative approach to the classroom, I considered some different ways that you might want to use comparison in this way to as you're teaching empire. So for example, you could make a comparison between different empires. In this case, I've said you could make a comparison between, say, the French, the English, and the Portuguese. That's because they had very different views of what the purpose of empire was. So the French had a concept called mission civilisatrice. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, so I'm very sorry. But that basically their sort of mission statement for what empire was they believed they were on a civilizing mission. And that's very different from, say, something like tropicalism, which was a concept that was created to sort of by the Portuguese in their way to sort of make what they felt they were doing seem justified and right for them, which was they believed in sort of an integration. But now a lot of discussion is about whether that integration, as they would have called tropicalism, was more just the Portuguese putting their culture in places like Brazil, rather than Brazilian culture actually being integrated into Portugal. But these are concepts which, if you could bring into a classroom and have sort of discussion and through comparing, learn more about the British Empire by seeing the differences in other empires. But then you can go further. You can also compare the experience in different colonies. I think it's really important that students don't learn about empire through solely the experience of one colony, because every colony's experience was so vastly different. You couldn't say that the imperial experience of the people who in Ireland is exactly the same as people who were living in Uganda. And then you can go even further and you can look at things like the lived-in experience of different peoples in one particular colony. For example, something like Australia, where you can look at sort of the experience of the Irish people that were living in Australia, sort of people who'd been deported there, and also indigenous peoples. There's some really great case studies that you can use to sort of do this comparative approach. A really good one that I like to use is Haiti and the Dominican Republic, because you have one island and you can see on this one island, because of the split, just how different an experience and how much things changed and why those things change. And it's a great way to sort of get pupils to understand just the varied experience of empire, and you're not just having an Anglo-centric, and you're not just teaching them about India and saying, okay, this is what everyone's experience of empire was like. And I think that's really important.
It's you, Jess, sorry.
Oh, yeah. The other key area with empire is to consider it from an intersectional approach as well. I think it's really important when we're teaching about empire, and if you're teaching about India, you're not just teaching about one group of people. India has many languages, many cultures, women, as Mike has been talking about with LGBT history, there's many aspects to empire than just the sort of surface level of talking about someone like Gandhi. Gandhi is very important, but there is a lot more to the story of India. And I think it's really important that when you're looking in the classroom, try and include those aspects. For example, a really great one is to include in the Egyptian independence, look at things like the rising of Egyptian feminism within that, because in Egypt they had one of the largest women's marches against British rule throughout the history of empire. And I think that's a really important part to look at, how that sort of link between independence and feminism. And it's great to sort of weave those things into what you're teaching.
And to sort of build on that, with the Indian National Congress actually had a women's branch, and also the independence movement for Ireland had a women's movement. And you can actually see in the constitutions of these newly founded nations that women had a defined central role, and that they were the constitutions were created with the universal suffrage in mind, which is quite, you know, it's brilliant for the time. So I think, you know, that's the end of our presentation, but I think that the discourse for empire is constantly evolving, and I think that it's the only appropriate way to look at empire is through a post-colonial approach. I think we have to sort of consider various viewpoints, be as diverse as we can in including the you know, various groups of peoples, cultures, languages, etc. And I think we need to stay abreast by constantly reviewing our subject knowledge and keeping abreast of the current developments within the discourse, to make sure that what we're teaching is current, acceptable, and up to date. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, you two. Just before we finish the formal part, I just want to raise a few things. One is that I think that builds really nicely on the work we did before on teaching emotional controversial history and the work we did on empire, migration and slavery. Mike, I was struck by what you were saying when you were talking about the work you've done on your thesis, about how implicit behind what you were saying was that we now have a wider knowledge and perhaps a wider respect for the value of different source material than perhaps was the case in the past. And I just wonder whether there was anything you can elaborate on. As historians, we are always basing our ideas on verifiable evidence, and the evidence base that we use, the source material we use as evidence, is really crucial. But in order to arrive at the perspectives that we have about empire today, I think we're using a wider range of source material than was the case back in the decades previously. Obviously, the work of Toby Green picks on this. What particular source material were you drawing on that perhaps wasn't available or wasn't so much used in the past?
To sort of get the recognition that Representative Assembly had been entrenched in Indian culture prior to British colonisation, I looked at things like Ashoka's statues. They were a series of obelisks that were established across northern India with inscriptions that were, I think they were in Sanskrit and also in ancient Greek, and it allowed us a chance to sort of, when they were translated, because of the ancient Greek being included, that there was democracy, there were democratic tones, I would say, and rules for living a good life. And I think that India, because it's such a complex society, that there's never been one homogenous group of, say, Indians. I mean, it's been part of several different empires. So that that flavour of West and East is, you know, part of the trade route. These ideas are flowing through India, and that was something that I looked at. But also I looked at historians deliberately went for ancient history books and what historians were saying, including trying to get Indian historians' work into my dissertation. It wasn't, I sort of deliberately went for a balanced view.
That's interesting, isn't it? The availability of knowledge internationally that's been facilitated by technological things such as the internet, but also then the interdisciplinary nature of university work, that linguists have gone to work on the columns, which means that historians can then pick up and use that material. No, thank you for adapting that. And it struck me as well that there was a real connection here with what Paula Lobo talks about using wider angle lenses in what you were talking about. So rather than just focusing on a narrow time period, you'd focus on much wider. So if we're looking right back into what would be the history of the Indian subcontinent, we're going back thousands of years and still finding out what was going on. Fascinating. Jess, when you were talking, you were very much talking about connections and comparisons that can be made, and some people will recognise this that hear this talking. This is a book that was produced in 1991 called Contrasts and Connections, and I just wanted to flag it up. This is not a textbook I would necessarily celebrate. It's very much of its time. However, what's interesting for the purposes of this is that this was produced in 1991 with the emphasis on comparing and contrasting with Year 7 the Roman Empire, medieval realms and Islamic civilizations. And I think it is important to realise that the school's history project, in fairness, for years has been trying to bring this aspect into schools. And while both the scholarship that underpins this would now be not as up to date as obviously scholarship is today, and also there are aspects of the way that it uses tiny bits of source material that we've now realised is not helpful in the classroom. It moved too far away from the story and the narrative in history. The actual approach of the idea of contrasting, I just wanted to flag up. And I just wanted to ask you one final question before we finish the formal bit, which is in relation to these very, very tricky substantive concepts. We wouldn't obviously be suggesting we walked into a Year 7 classroom and start talking about post-colonial and intersectional, and even though those may be important disciplines to engage with and critique and understand so that they inform our practice. So where would you start in terms of developing a student's understanding in relation to substantive concepts? We've talked possibly about looking at empire but in comparative ways. Is there anything else you would like to say about either of you or both of you about how we might start understanding where pupils are and where you might begin with this massive topic?
I would say, I think with relation to those sort of large topics, I certainly wouldn't be introducing something like the concept of post-colonialism as we've introduced it today to a Year 7 class. But I do think where it starts is with the teacher. And if the teacher has these concepts in mind when they're making their planning, if they do have an idea of, I want these lessons to have an element of intersectionality, I do want to make sure that we are weaving in the stories of many groups and many peoples into this lesson, that comes through to the kids. And then as they grow up, they have that intersectional history in mind. If you are weaving in women's movements, if you are ensuring that when you're teaching about, say, Uganda, you are mentioning that Uganda was actually many different kingdoms with many different religions and ways of life. If you're doing that throughout when you're teaching, then that, I think, comes through as they get older, and eventually when they get to that point, that concept is already there, and you can just go, well, you have been learning intersectional history, because they have been, and that understanding is always there. I think it's important that the teacher has that within them, that they already have that sort of mission statement in place, and then it just sort of weaves in naturally almost.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Jess. I think that post-colonialism is just, it's seeking a balance. So it's not going for, those sweeping statements that traditional histories tend to rely on. We did this, we introduced this, we. It's actually asking what the Indian or it's the colonized perspective, and it's weaving those stories, those peoples, those histories into your overall lesson plans. I think it's just diversity and inclusivity, and also just being sensitive in how you teach the subject.
Thank you. And yes, respect for human beings and an understanding that human beings have many, many different opinions and have now and have in the past is obviously at the core of what we do. Thank you very much indeed, both of you.